some I've not. I spent most of Sunday evening through, I don't know, pretty close to about Thursday in one position, which was kind of on my right side, trying to find some relief from this strange back pain that would not let go and still is kind of hanging on. But I definitely appreciate the expressed sympathy. You know, I've been on the other end of that and had people say, "Oh, you wouldn't know how much the prayers have meant," and you know, I get that. But when you're actually on this side of it and you experience so many people praying, you know, I can say that genuinely. You don't know how much the prayers mean. And even, you know, we're speaking of prayer, as we've been working through the prayer guide. Did you, day 5, Friday, anybody else do that? So I read that while I was laying on my side, a little bit angry about the pain I was going through, and realized I had nobody to blame for writing that devotional but myself, as the topic was patience and waiting on God to do things. And you know, and I've been asking, okay, God, take this pain away. But the prayer guide has been, I think, very rich in many ways. Hopefully, you know, I've heard from several of you. It's been rich for me. Going back through and reading these scriptures and having just a couple of questions to contemplate. And what I want to say is, yes, we started this on the 15th, but it's a 2-week thing. And so if you have not participated yet, you can jump in. And if you haven't had the chance, you know, I have not had the chance to do a fasting piece connected to it yet, because I'm dumping all these medications in my body to this point that require there to be some food in my stomach. But I'm hoping this week that I'll be able to finish this time off with some fasting, as hopefully maybe I don't need those medications anymore toward the end of the week, and we'll be able to really spend some focused time in prayer, which is so valuable and so rich. And so to whatever level that you're using it, I encourage you to continue using it, or if you haven't been engaging yet with the prayer guide, again, you can find that on the website. You can find it on the app. It's the top thing in the app. You just click on there. You should be receiving the daily emails, although sometimes those have been staged kind of funny and didn't go out the way that I thought they were supposed to. And then also, if you're following us on Facebook, they go out on Facebook every day as well. And so those are posted at 6 a.m. So you can check them out that way. I encourage you to engage, especially because this idea of praying for purpose really pairs with this series that we're engaged in right now called Not on My Watch, Understanding the Times and Knowing What to Do. Now, I mentioned it last week, and I had some questions about this particular passage or this reference that I made to these mighty men of David from this tribe of Issachar that are called out in 1 Chronicles chapter 12, and you'll see that verse on the screen in just a minute. They are called out for understanding the times and knowing what to do. Now, all these other mighty men of David and these tribes are called out for having this many warriors who knew how to use a bow and knew how to use a sling, and they were really solid in battle. And remember, we're going to call out this feat that these guys did, as they were really mighty, triumphant, courageous, all these things. But these particular men from the tribe of Issachar are called out for this one thing that I find extremely significant. Again, it's this. From Issachar, there were men who understood the times and knew what Israel should do. Which is why I've been trying to make the case for us this month that we need to understand the times. We're living in a unique time. Now, again, you could say that every time is a unique time, and that is true on some level, but I think we're living in a unique time, especially for the Western church, where we're finding ourselves facing things that we have not faced, at least within any of our generational experiences. Is that fair to say? And things are changing and shifting around us in a way that we almost can't account for more quickly than we can even imagine. That is what's happening around us. And so you and I, it's very important that you and I, who are trying, we're seeking to follow God faithfully, we need to understand what's happening right now. The way that we've been saying that this month is that we need to understand the story that the culture around us is telling. Okay, so another way of saying that is asking this question, well, what is the dominant cultural narrative at play in the Western world today? And what we've said is it's the postmodern worldview. And so in that, I've just real quickly said, here are 3 things that I think really characterize the postmodern worldview. It's the belief that we can make our own truth. Okay, you hear this all the time. You live your own truth. Or, you know, the saying that was popular a few years ago, and I'm probably already dating myself by saying this, all right? So kids, if this is the truth, you tell me I'm dating myself. But the saying that was popular a few years ago is, you do you, boo. You guys still say that? No? That's done? Yeah. That's what you get for trying to be cool. So, but the idea is there, right? We make our own truth. Okay? So you do your own thing. You make your own truth. Your truth is your truth. Don't let anybody else tell you what's truth. Your truth comes from within, not from an objective source, right? So the same thing then that flows from this kind of makes sense, is that we make our own meaning, or maybe a better way of saying that is that we define our own meaning and purpose in life. So we get to decide what life is all about. And then the last thing that's really big in this is that nothing matters more in life than happiness. And you see this in so many different pursuits in the culture around us, and you see it sometimes rubbing off on us in the church as well, is that we've determined that nothing matters more in life than happiness. What I used to say when I worked in youth ministry to our teenagers is, God is more concerned with your faithfulness than he is with your happiness. Right? It's not that God doesn't care about us being happy on some level, but we as Christians find our happiness in our expression of faithfulness to God. In fact, genuine happiness comes from doing the thing that God asks us to do, not going out and living our own truth, not going out and defining our own meaning, right? But this is all led to this place, this postmodern worldview. Obviously, you can see where these ideals, these values really rub up against Christian values, right? Against Christian ideals, against a Jesus-centered way. And so as more and more of the nation, more and more of Western culture has said, yes, we're for that and not for this other thing, we have become post-Christian. Last week I shared with you real quickly what post-Christian means, real fast. It's no longer embracing a Christian worldview or accepting the wisdom of Christian values as a rule. And then there's a second part of this that is always, I think, very interesting. It's the second, while continuing to enjoy many of the benefits of a society established upon these principles. What a lot of people who've gone postmodern don't realize is that the things they like, such as human rights, right? Caring about people because everybody matters. Well, why does everybody matter? Well, that idea came from Scripture. It's that everyone is made in the image of God, therefore everyone matters. I mean, James says that. We learned that right at the beginning of the creation narrative. You're made in the image of God. And so why is this person valuable? Because God made them, and they're made in his image. Therefore, they're valuable. But you remove that piece, now tell me why they're valuable. Well, nobody thought that everyone was valuable, that every human being had value before Jesus. Or certainly you could say that the Jews did. The Jews had that idea. But outside of the Jewish population, nobody really had the idea that everyone was valuable. Even that was a struggle sometimes within the Jewish culture as well. But certainly outside of the Jewish culture, not everyone had value just because they existed. You only had value based upon what you could contribute to society, and in many cases, how strong you were, how powerful you were. That was what gave you your value. Okay, and so the society, the culture within still wants to enjoy many of the things that Christianity, that the Judeo-Christian worldview has brought about, which again is always very interesting. I also introduced this concept last week, this idea of deconstruction, saying this is what's led us to this place of becoming more and more post-Christian. Here's the quick definition of that again. That deconstruction is the act of piece by piece taking apart a belief system, worldview, that was once adhered to, in our case, Christianity, and then replacing it with another. Oftentimes this leads to saying, oh, there are some things about Christianity I still like, but there's these other things I don't like, therefore I'm going to jettison these things, I'm going to hold on to these things, and I'm going to bring in a whole bunch of new things. And so it's led us to the place where we are today, which is why we're engaged in this series, which is why I think we need to have this conversation as Christians. If we don't, we're sort of burying our heads in the sand and saying, look, what happens around us doesn't matter. Well, what happens around us matters for a number of reasons, like I've said, because the culture around us rubs off on us. And we are still called to be the people who engage culture for the sake of Christ with the gospel, right? So the way that we've said this month is to say this, that I think Jesus is calling us to embrace a better way that centers on him. As opposed to engaging with what culture is engaging, Jesus says, no, you continue to find your truth in me, your meaning and purpose in me, and understand that real happiness, if we want to use that word, that real joy in life comes by following Jesus faithfully. We looked at that last week as we talked about the woman at the well, remember? who was coming back day to day to dip water from the well, and Jesus says, I can give you living water if you want that. Water that will lead you to this place where you'll never thirst again. And so the way we wrapped up that message is by saying this last week, if we use the lingo that we use in the first message of this series, that the better story that we are called to believe and live centers on Jesus. Again, we can keep coming back to dip water from a well that will never fully satisfy. Of course, that's a metaphor for the culture around us or anything that's not Jesus, right? We can keep coming back to that well thinking we're going to find happiness there. Right? And I've shared with you all before, I've got a master's in counseling, so I've done quite a bit of counseling. There are a lot of times where I've engaged with people, they're trying to find happiness in all these different places in life. When I was doing my internship for my master's in counseling, I worked at a counseling center, and I drew what everybody thought was the short stick, and it was a very, very tough thing. It wasn't the short stick, though, because I was engaging with people that mattered. Again, everybody's made in the image of God. And so my assignment was adolescent substance abuse. And boy, it was tough. I worked with kids all the way down to 8 years old that were already addicted to substances. And what you found out over and over again in their lives is they had this hole, and they were trying to fill it. They had a hole, and they were trying to fill it. There's a famous French philosopher who once said, each one of us has within us a God-shaped hole. And we can try to put a whole lot of different things in that hole, but if it isn't God, it doesn't fit, and it's not going to satisfy. So we can keep coming back to dip water from a well that will never fully satisfy, or we can have, as Jesus offered to the woman at the well, we can have living water. Now, I've alluded to this several times, and I want to take this a step further this morning before we jump into our text. Here's the reality about secular humanism and the postmodern worldview. Okay, secular humanism and the postmodern worldview have made some really big promises. In other words, saying, we can tell you what life is really all about and how to find meaning and purpose in life. We can tell you how to find what you believe is truth in life. We can tell you even how to be happy. So we have the answers to life. Okay, that's come out of the postmodern worldview and this idea of secular humanism. Okay, so there have been some really big promises that have been made, but here's again what I've alluded to several times is this: these promises have gone largely unfulfilled in the culture around us. And maybe you lived your life before coming to Jesus, pursuing all these things that you thought would make you happy, and you reached that place in your life too where you hit a wall and you realized all these things I'm chasing after have not made me happy. In fact, I'm more miserable than I ever was. What can I do? And for a lot of people, that's where they find Jesus, is at the end of that road. What I want to tell you is we have a culture that is finding out the futility of chasing after all these things that they thought would make them happy, brought about by chasing after these worldviews or chasing after the promises of these worldviews, and saying, I'm not happy. In fact, I'm less happy than I've ever been. Okay, so again, the idea is this: if we go after our own truth, we define our own meaning and purpose in life, then we'll be happy. How many of you ever heard of this thing called the happiness index? Did you even know there was such a thing? The happiness index? I mean, I didn't either before, working on this series, so don't feel bad, but there's this thing out there called the happiness index, and I want to tell you this: it's been around since the 1950s. Okay, there's a group that measures just how happy people are. Now, this is self-report stuff, and so there's a whole bunch of questions that are asked, and maybe you've participated in the happiness survey, the happiness index study at some point in time. I never have, but maybe you have. Maybe you are familiar with it. Okay, so since the 1950s, what I want to tell you this: since we've been measuring happiness in the U.S., since the 1950s, the U.S. score on the happiness index has been in steady decline. Can you imagine that's possible? I mean, look at all the things that have happened since the 1950s. I mean, cars have gotten more and more efficient. We've got computers that can do amazing things. We have, and you may have in your house, you can get on your cell phone and you may have this round little machine in your house that it means that you don't have to do this motion anymore, right? This back and forth vacuuming. I hate vacuuming, by the way. Quick way to make me angry is put a vacuum in my hand. I don't know why it does it, but it's just the reaction I have. Vacuum equals anger. But we don't have to vacuum anymore because we now have this round thing, this Roomba that goes around and vacuums things up in our house, and so we don't have to do it anymore. And we've got all these toys and gadgets that are supposed to make life better and simpler. I mean, we have air conditioning that we can mostly count on, right? Right, amen. By the way, have you guys noticed how sharp and snappy a dresser Joe is? Has anybody noticed? I mean, boy, that guy knows how to pick out good-looking shirts and pants. If you can't see, Joe and I are dressed exactly alike today. I don't know how that happened. The unread memo that somehow we both read in our sleep. So here's the thing, and this is what the Chicago Tribune concluded in April 9th of 2006 as they wrote this article. So all the way back to April 9th of 2006. We're sneaking up on 20 years ago at this point. Okay, but already then, at that point in time, things were starting to unravel. The postmodern dream was falling apart already at that point in time. What they concluded in this article is that life was not better by the way you and I would typically define better, all the modern conveniences we have. Life was not better in the 1950s, but people were happier in the 1950s. Before the postmodern worldview really took a hold of this nation. Before, people believed that they could go after their own truth, their own meaning, and then they would be happy. No, in fact, what they concluded, the Chicago Tribune, okay, which is not Christian, not a super conservative thinking paper. I mean, nothing along those lines. But what they concluded is that this way of thinking, again, what you see on the screen behind you, go after your own truth, define your own meaning and purpose in life, then you'll be truly happy, that this way of thinking has only led us to an unhealthy pursuit of radical individualism. And because of that pursuit of radical individualism, we are way less happy than we were in the 1950s. Now, here are some of the things that they said that have occurred because of this pursuit, this way of thinking. First, they say that we are left in this nation with deep relational deficits. Deep relational deficits. Now, do you know that 2006 was before the widespread adoption of social media, which has only made this worse? Okay, when many in a younger generation, their most meaningful relational encounters happen over with their phone in their hands and not face-to-face with someone else, this has only gotten worse. And there have been documentaries made about this at this point in time. Okay, so deep relational deficits. They also said it has left us with a loneliness epidemic. Now, that's the first time going back that far that I can actually find this idea, this phrase of loneliness epidemic coined. But this has become something talked about more and more in the last several years, this idea of having a loneliness epidemic. They also said this is wild, again, not a Christian publication, not a particularly conservative group of thinkers, but they said it's left us with an existential meaning crisis. Now, I talked about John Vervaeke in the first message, this psychologist at the University of Toronto who's launched what he calls the Meaning Project because he's looking around, again, not a Christian as well. He is a spiritual searcher, but not a Christian. He's looking around saying, we have this real existential meaning crisis, especially in the younger generation right now. They don't know what life is about, and he's coined the phrase out of this, especially with young men, he says, we now have reached this place where we have an epidemic of deaths of despair. Young men taking their lives at an unprecedented rate because they look around at life and say, what is this about? There's no purpose in any of this. Why am I doing this at all? Okay, and then the last thing that they say, now this has only been amplified since 2006 as well, is that it's left us with a radically divided society. Anyone feel that? Okay, a radically divided society. Now, as I read through that, what I conclude is that there's got to be a better way, right? I mean, chasing after meaning, purpose, and value in life that we determine as meaning, purpose, and value in life, defining our own truth, making our own truth, saying that there's nothing more that matters in life than happiness, if that's where this has led us, then there has to be a better way. And I want to say, yes, there absolutely is a better way. And we find it over and over and over again in the encounters of Scripture, especially in Jesus' encounters with people who were searching for what life was really all about. Or maybe got to that place where they reached rock bottom. And I think we're going to see a guy today that you'll see, he reached rock bottom at some point in time because he was desperate to find out what life was really all about. What was really true. What really was the meaning and purpose of life. And if there was such a thing as happiness or real true joy, how could he find that real true joy? If you got your Bibles, I'll invite you to open up to Luke chapter 19. And maybe you know where we're going already, especially if you've been a student of Scripture for a number of years. You probably do. One of my favorite verses in Scripture is in this passage that we'll read together. It'll be Luke 19:10, and I think when we get there, you'll see why I love this particular verse of Scripture. Luke 19:10 tells the story of a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. He climbed up in a sycamore tree, right, for the Lord he wanted to see. Maybe you remember that song from Vacation Bible School. How many of you remember that song from Vacation Bible School? Be honest. You don't have to be embarrassed. It's okay to like kid things every now and then, or at least remember them, right? I'm not going to sing the song for you this morning because that would be embarrassing, but you definitely remember the song, and maybe you remember the story. Well, this is the story of Zacchaeus, and I want you to see it, not just the kid version of it. I want you to see Luke as he details this story of Jesus engaging Zacchaeus, or really Zacchaeus coming and trying to engage with Jesus, the lengths that he was willing to go to. So this is what we read. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. Okay. In case you don't understand the context of this story, let's get it, because Luke is giving his readers some immediate context. For those of us separated nearly 2,000 years from the context of the first century, we may miss some of this. Okay, so Jesus is entering Jericho. Jesus is now making his way toward Jerusalem. Jericho is on the way. Jesus is walking through Jericho. And people would have known that Jesus was going from place to place because everywhere Jesus went, there was a crowd that followed him and a buzz that went in front of him. Okay, so I want you to think about something like that. And maybe that's hard for us in our society to imagine that, but in his day, Jesus was a really big deal. And so as he walked from town to town, it was like a celebrity showing up in town. And here was Jesus, and everybody in front would have known what was about to happen. Here comes Jesus. So there is this man in Jericho named Zacchaeus. Now Luke tells us about Zacchaeus that he was a tax collector, not just a tax collector, he was a chief tax collector. And then there's the second part that goes with that, he was wealthy. He was really wealthy. Okay, let's break that down real quickly. The Romans would often seek or appoint. They would appoint people of their own nation, not the Roman nation, but the nation that the Romans occupied. So in this case, the Romans would look for Jews to become tax collectors because they felt like it was a better thing for for people of their own people to go and collect taxes from their people instead of Romans just coming and collecting taxes. Now, certainly they did that from time to time, but they would often see, for example, as they had the Jews in captivity to some degree or oppression in any shape, in any way, they would look to see, can we find some Jews to become tax collectors? And so a lot of Jews would become tax collectors because it was a lucrative business for certain. So Zacchaeus was one of these who says, yes, I'll do this. Now, not only does Zacchaeus become a tax collector, he becomes a chief tax collector. Now, while the Romans were looking for Jews to become tax collectors and go gather revenue from their own people, the Jews had a way that they felt, and maybe you can imagine how the Jews would have felt about that, because here were the Roman occupiers, and here was a Jew now working for the Roman occupiers, collecting taxes. And so in many cases, these people that became tax collectors were thought of as traitors. Okay, so they had been working they'd been Jewish people who were now working for the Romans. Matthew was one of these as well. Okay, now Zacchaeus was not just a tax collector, he was a chief tax collector, and beyond that, he was wealthy. How did tax collectors become wealthy? Well, the Romans allowed them to cull a little bit on the side, and the more you culled on the side for yourself, the more wealthy you could become. So Zacchaeus not only collected the Roman tax that was due, but he would go and say, hey, by the authority of the Roman government, I'm here to collect maybe, I don't know, what, double what the Romans asked for? Or maybe it wasn't that much. But he was collecting more than what was due the Romans so that he could get his kickback in a sense, and he was doing it on Roman authority. And so really the Jews were powerless to say, no, we're not going to do that, because he could use the Roman authority that was his authority then to actually have them thrown in jail. So you either pay the taxes or you get thrown in jail. Not so unlike today's society, right? Pay your taxes or you're in trouble. So you may imagine now how Zacchaeus was thought about in Jericho. Probably not a super popular guy, right? Probably nobody really liked him. The Romans probably didn't really like him. He was just a useful tool. And his own people definitely didn't like him. But Zacchaeus has this moment where as he hears Jesus is coming by, and Luke tells us he wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. Okay, another important detail about Zacchaeus. So Zacchaeus wants to see Jesus, but he's not going to be able to see Jesus because he knows if I'm just part of the crowd, there's no way I'm actually going to be able to get my eyes on this guy. I've heard he's special. I want to see for myself. Okay, so we can conclude that clearly there was some amount of tension in Zacchaeus' life. If he would have felt like life is great and I'm just going to keep on doing what I'm doing, Zacchaeus may have just ignored this guy, Jesus, who's coming into town. He may have just said, why do I care about Jesus? I'm living the high life. I'm rolling in money. I'm filthy rich. I'm fine. I've got everything I need and could ever want. Right? I've bought it. Everything. If there's something new that I want, I'll go buy that. But clearly, Zacchaeus knew he was missing something in his life. He was not satisfied, just as the woman who went to the well over and over and over again was not satisfied, as we saw last week. Okay, now back to Zacchaeus. Here's what Luke tells us. Remember, Zacchaeus was really short. He wasn't going to be able to see Jesus. So he ran ahead. Now, there's some really important clues in this text that we're going to need to pull apart as well. He ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him since Jesus was coming that way. Now, you may have heard this when a preacher talks about the story of the prodigal son in Luke 15. Remember, the prodigal son, the father runs to meet the son, and so maybe you've heard that talked about before, that running was not a dignified thing or not something that someone who wanted to maintain their dignity, especially a man, would do in Jewish society. You didn't hurry anywhere, you walked because everything could wait on you if you were important. Okay, so Zacchaeus ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree. Again, you can see there's a tension in his life somewhere. He's willing to pursue something in a way that shows there's maybe a desperation for something different. Okay, so he ran and climbed a sycamore fig tree. Now, climbing a tree for a grown man was also probably not the most dignified thing that he could have done as well at that point in time. So we see the desperation in Zacchaeus coming out. So when Jesus reached the spot where Zacchaeus had climbed up into the sycamore fig tree, he looked up and said, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." Now, this seems kind of like a pretty abrupt turn in this story, right? Like we accidentally hit skip forward on a DVD, or, well, we don't really use DVDs anymore. I was going to go all the way back to VCRs, and probably, some of us know what VCRs, right? VCRs are. My kids probably don't really know what a VCR is, but that's fine. But it almost seems like we skipped a scene. You get the point? We're at this place where immediately as Jesus is passing through, he sees Zacchaeus. He says, "Zacchaeus, come down. I must go to your house today." Now remember, Jesus was able to know what was going on in someone's life. Just as he knew last week what was going on in the life of this woman. He knew her story. Remember what she says? "He told me everything I ever did." Jesus knew what was going on in Zacchaeus' life. He knew the state of his heart. He knew that Zacchaeus was aware he was missing something in life, or that maybe he had said, this is important in life, but something else was about to be much more important. So Zacchaeus came down and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He's gone to be the guest of a sinner." So now if we have any wondering how the people felt about Zacchaeus, mean, often in the New Testament, in the gospel stories, you see that Jesus was eating with tax collectors and sinners, right? I mean, they're just lumped together. Here are these sinners. Jesus was eating with sinners. Well, he's gone again in this case to be the guest of a sinner. And so the people were mumbling, they were grumbling about this. So in this moment, here's what happens. I want you to see this. But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anyone out of anything," I think he knows he's cheated a lot of people out of a lot of things, right? "If now I've cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount that I overcharged." Jesus said to him in this moment, "Today salvation has come to this house, for this man too is a son of Abraham." And I love this last verse. This is Luke 19:10. "For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost." Okay, one of my favorite verses of Scripture. So good for us to remember. It's Jesus' mission statement in life. I came to seek and save lost people. Now, I want to ask you, as you read through this story, certainly we see Zacchaeus responding in a really radical way. I'm going to give half of everything I have to the poor in this moment, right now. And Zacchaeus, I imagine, had probably also been shrewd in the way that he invested his money. So probably everything he took, he'd been growing. That money had been, the sum had been growing larger and larger as time had gone on. So he says, and if anybody I've cheated, all the people that I've cheated, I'm going to go and track these folks down. I imagine he kept ledgers, detailed ledgers. I'm going to go and track these folks down, and I'm going to give them 4 times more. I'm going to give them back 4 times what I cheated them out of. An incredibly radical response. I bet Zacchaeus watched his bank account dwindle pretty quickly. And it's not just what he did because Jesus told him he had to do. This is what's so wild about this story. Jesus didn't say, "Zacchaeus, if you want to follow me," now remember, he says that to a man we often call the rich young ruler. He says, "Here's what you need to do if you want to follow me." Zacchaeus says to Jesus, "Here's what I'm going to do in this moment, because I think I found what life is really all about." So why did Zacchaeus respond in such a radical way? Well, I think simply this. He had a strong suspicion that there was a better way of doing life. I mean, he had reached that place in life where he was utterly broken. What we know about tax collectors is often, their family felt betrayed by them. And so they walked away from everything they had. They left relationships behind in the pursuit of financial wealth. And Zacchaeus realizes, what I've been chasing after is worthless. There's got to be a better way of doing life. Or the way that we've been saying that this month since the beginning of this message, maybe we could say that Zacchaeus knew there had to be a better story, a better narrative in life. So again, we're in this series, Not on My Watch. How does this help us? Because remember, like the men of Issachar, we want to be people, and I want to help equip us to be people who understand the times and know what we should do. So again, here's the case that I'm making. We've got to understand the story that the culture around us is telling. We've got to understand the way that it's rubbed off on us sometimes and the way we've been influenced. But we need to understand the story that the culture around us is telling. Why? Because we've got to understand the way the church in this moment is being called to respond. Right? We need to understand the way in which the church is being called to respond in this particular moment. Here's what I believe. I believe ultimately all people are on a quest to try to figure out what life is about. I mean, I believe that. I mean, maybe there are some who are so depraved, I don't know, but let's say at least the vast majority of people are trying to figure out what life is all about. And they're looking for answers in a lot of different places. And in most of those places, they're finding the wrong answers. And so where should we be as a church? Well, I think here's where we need to be as a church as we consider our position. Again, if we're people who understand the times and know what we should do, we need to be at a place where we are able to say to a world, let me show you And really that word show is important in there. It's not just let me tell you. Let me show you. In fact, the slide didn't transfer well. There's supposed to be a line through tell in there. Okay, let me show you, not just tell you, why the Christian worldview makes sense of the reality in which we live. Okay, before we go any further, I want to introduce this, or not introduce this, I just want to maybe re-explain 3 false sub-narratives that we sometimes believe within the church. Okay, so there's the dominant cultural narrative, 3 narratives that are sub-narratives of that we sometimes believe, or at least as it relates to cultural narratives. The first is this. Remember, we talked about this in the first message. The dominant culture in America is the Christian culture. It's not anymore, right? I mean, most of the studies reveal that. It is no longer the dominant culture in the Western world and not in North America either, okay? So when we still believe that, we don't understand the times in which we live, okay? The second that we sometimes believe is this. I can live the Christian life while embracing the values of the culture around me. That's also a false narrative that we are tempted to believe within the church. Now, the third is very important as well. This last one I want you to pay attention to, and it's a little bit nuanced. The third is this. There are many churches that believe that if we're going to reach into culture, that the church must narrow the gap between church and culture. Here's what I mean. As we look out at the culture, as you look out at the culture around you, and maybe as you're trying to engage people who don't believe in Jesus, have you ever felt like, boy, there's such a big gap between us? I mean, I'm speaking a different language than they're speaking sometimes. We're not saying the same things. We're not thinking the same things at all in any way, shape, or form. And so there are churches that have said, you know what, if we're going to reach the world, the culture, we can't pull the culture closer to us. So what can we move? Well, maybe we can move a little. We can budge a little. Maybe there are some places where we can compromise, and we ought to compromise as the church. And so we end up compromising things that are rooted in eternal when the culture is ever shifting. It's a moving target constantly, right? But we decide we're going to compromise the one thing we think we have control over, which is the message of God. But when we compromise the message of God, it's no longer the message of God, it just becomes our message. And that's a real danger too. And the motivation there, I think, is good, is we still want to reach people. But the way that we reach people when we compromise the message of God is not good. We can't compromise the message of God. We have to treat it as truth over and over and over again. So, what does a better way look like? Well, we're going to highlight the word this time. Let me show you why the Christian worldview makes more sense. In other words, let me show you a better way. And what does that better way look like? If we're going to look to the example of Jesus, what does it look like? Well, here's what it looks like. And I think you're going to see some things that are valued in the culture versus what we as Christians, as Christ followers, will value. First, it's this. It's self-sacrifice instead of self-indulgence. We're willing to give ourselves and the things we even want and desire for the sake of others. It's choosing light over darkness and realizing that it really is as distinct as that. Yeah, there's some gray. There's no doubt. There's some gray, and we've got to leave room for gray. But over and over again, Jesus says, I'm the light. John says that he came as light into darkness. And we're supposed to be a people who hold forth his word, and in so doing, we shine like stars in the night sky. So it's a conversation of light and darkness. We need to understand that my truth is no substitute for God's truth. Okay? We've got to understand that. We need to understand this as well, that my personal meaning is ultimately meaningless. And I know that's a strong word, but it's true. My personal meaning is ultimately meaningless because only God can bestow meaning and purpose. What I mean is this. Meaning is not discovered, it's bestowed. You see the difference? Well, I'm on a quest for meaning. I'm going searching for meaning. Well, unless you find it from the meaning giver, you're not going to find it. This next one, if I set personal happiness as my target and reason for living, I'm instead charting a course that will ultimately lead to misery. And then this. The better story centers on a choice to seek and build God's kingdom first, as opposed to building my own kingdom. In other words, this. The right way is the way of Jesus. And by comparison, okay, I want you to see that word. By comparison, when we compare the way of Jesus to anything else, we see that whatever else that thing is an imposter or opposer. The way of Jesus is the right way, and nothing else is. So it moves us to be people like this, sort of like Zacchaeus. I want to read to you these 3 verses out of Matthew 13. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. Now, unless we see the reality of that treasure, we won't be like this man. Okay? The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again. Now, this sounds a little shady, but that's okay in this parable, right? When he found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy went and sold all he had and bought that field. I'm giving everything I have so I can have this other thing. Again, Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for fine pearls. When he found one of great value, he went away and sold everything he had and bought that pearl. In other words, the way of Jesus, it's the right way. And by comparison, everything else is an imposter. You know, Zacchaeus had a strong suspicion that there had to be a better way of doing life. And so I want to ask us this question: what about us? What about us? Because it always starts looking inward first. What about us? Are there places where we have traded the way of Jesus for something else that by comparison is an imposter? And then the second piece, what about the people around us? Right? The right way of Jesus. The right way is the way of Jesus, and by comparison, everything else is an imposter. So, here's the challenge again this morning, is for us first to examine ourselves and ask, where has the world had an influence on me where I have compromised and traded out the pearl for something else? Where have I been like Zacchaeus and chased after meaning and purpose and value in life in things that will never really give meaning, purpose, and value? Is that true about me on any level? That's for those of us who are already following Jesus. If you're not following Jesus this morning, maybe you reach that place just like Zacchaeus did. And you realize, I've been chasing after everything. I remember that moment in my life where I realized I'm messing everything I touch gets broken and gets messed up because I'm trying to do it my way. There's got to be a better way. Maybe you've hit that place in your life where this morning you're saying there's got to be a better way. And the really good news is there is a better way. Not just a better way, the best way, the one true right way of living life. And it's living for His glory. If you've reached that place, we're going to sing a song. I'm going to invite both Joe and Kathy back up, and I'm going to slowly move my stool back this way. We're going to sing a song called We Fall Down, and it is a perfect song to sing in this moment. And I want to challenge you to really think about these words. The words say this: we fall down, we lay our crowns. What is our crowns? It's the things we believe have value in life, that give us significance. I'm a king because of this thing in life. I found purpose in this thing in life. But I want to tell you this: if it's not Jesus, it won't satisfy. But if you trade that thing for Jesus, you'll find something that satisfies not just in this moment, but for every moment and for all of eternity. Let's stand as we sing this song together.